So there are so many questions and so many comments. They cannot all be dealt with comprehensively, so apologies for the things that I don't deal with, and I might be a little bit rambling because I'm trying to cover as much as possible, and I hope Joseph can pick up the things that I don't deal with. What I want to do really is to make this initial basic point about the character of revolution, which I think will encompass an answer to a lot of the questions and the specific points that have been made. It is the usual pattern in great revolutions that they begin with an explosion of revolt from below, which actually is resisted, not just by the regime, but by some other forces in society. I mean, we saw an example of that in Tahrir Square when Mubarak unleashed his thugs. I mean, plainclothes police, plainclothes security, but probably significant numbers of people who are actually on the bandwagon of cronyism and corruption and who are beneficiaries of the regime. I mean, there isn't a regime in the world that doesn't have some kind of minimal base of social support. So there's always some resistance. But what tends to happen in the initial phase of a revolution is that after the revolution, everybody's a supporter of it. Everybody is embracing the idea, which is why, of course, you will have the Egyptian generals presenting themselves now as people who are going to manage the transition to democracy. You cannot operate politically in Egypt now if you're an opponent of democracy, in effect. And this is the pattern in all of the great revolutions. The problem is, of course, that all of the major issues which the revolution has to address are not yet being addressed. And the truth is always concrete. I mean, if you gather together a group of people and you say to them, hands up everybody who believes in truth, everybody will put their hand up. If you say to them, hands up everybody who believes in everyone having a say, if they're honest, there might be one or two actually who actually don't think everybody should have a say because they're the bosses or the police or whatever. If you then say, how many people think that workers should run their own workplaces democratically? Then there'll be quite a lot of resistance, not just from people who have an interest in opposing it, but from people who aren't yet convinced that that actually is a way in which you can run society. So that at the beginning of the revolutionary process, not only is there lots of vested interest which is going to pile in to stop the revolution moving forward, there's also lots of people who aren't yet convinced about how far you have to go. And it's only when people try and win the reforms, the changes that they thought the revolution was about, and come up against resistance, that they discover that the people that they've put their faith in initially don't actually represent them, after all, aren't going to implement the reforms which they said they were going to implement, after all. So you have to look to other kinds of democratic structure, other kinds of mass activity, other political leaderships. Now, if we take the example of Russia in 1917, after the fall of the Tsar in February 1917, there was a widespread unanimity across the revolutionary movement and across the country in support of the provisional government. And it was only when people began to push for a thoroughgoing democratisation and push for improvements in their position as workers and peasants, the peasants pushing for taking over the estates, the workers pushing for control of the workplaces, and when people pushed for an end to the war, an end to the imperialist slaughter that was going on in the trenches, and found actually that provisional government was opposing all of those things, that you had a process of radicalisation which meant that people began to put their faith in other kinds of democratic organisation, other expressions of the people organised, A, to struggle, but also to take control of their lives. Now, if you take 1789, the dynamic takes even longer to unfold. I mean, the revolution which breaks out in July 1789 in France doesn't reach its most radical phase, where the most radical policies are being pushed through, until 1793. So when questions are asked about, but you know, your questions in particular, about, is it really the case that everybody involved actually has this kind of vision of the revolution, or is this a socialist revolution, or is it actually another kind of revolution, or what about the class forces that are actually involved? Actually, these are all concrete questions which will be decided by the historical process itself as people seek to make a reality of democracy, as people seek to make a reality of improvements in their position if they're unemployed, or if they're on low wages, or if they've got rotten public services, or whatever it is. And they look at the wealth at the top, and the corruption at the top, and the determination of those existing vested interests to defend themselves behind a veneer of parliamentary democracy, or whatever it happens to be. It is that experience that will further radicalise people and win much larger numbers of people to the kind of radical solutions which are actually going to be necessary if people are going to solve their problems. This last point on this, and then I am going to stop and let Joseph take over, it is that workers and ordinary people who become part of a revolutionary movement, more generally, they do not make the jump in a single leap from mass protest for democracy to revolutionary socialism. What they do is they go first, instinctively, for what seems to be the most obvious, the easiest option, which might be that you put your faith in Barraday, for example, that you think, he's going to be a president that's actually going to bring about the great transformation of Egypt which you aspire to. Because that's easy. It's easy to put your faith in a figure who's emerged in the course of the movement, who seems to represent everybody, seems to be saying the right things. It's the easy option. It's much, much harder to actually build mass, sustained, popular organisation and to drive out every one of them, one by one. Every boss, every police chief, every state informer, everybody who wants to hold it back and stop the thoroughgoing democratisation that needs to happen at the base. People go first for the easiest option, and it's only the hard experience of struggle in the context of a revolution that creates the radicalisation that means we could, in 2 years' time, in 4 years' time, in whatever, actually be looking at a whole new phase of the revolution and a push towards socialist revolution. And the last thing I would say is this then. That will not happen of its own accord. It requires organisation and leadership. It requires, most immediately in relation to Egypt, it requires activists on the left, socialists, people in the workers' movement coming together to create political organisation which can give expression to the aspirations of the common people collectively, not just the workers, but the common people as a whole. Give political expression to that and begin to organise them so that they can fight independently of all elements of the existing regime, of all elements of the ruling class, and advance the interests of the Egyptian masses as a whole. You have to actually build the organisations and the networks that will give people the understanding, the framework, the organisational structures that will enable them to do that, which is why we have meetings like this, not because we're trying to do that in Egypt, we can't do it in Egypt, but because we need to build these kinds of organisations everywhere so that there is this kind of possibility of structuring a real struggle, not just for democratic change, but a real struggle for social transformation and a real liberation of humanity. Sorry, I've got to go.